Okay, so I'm going to lead things off from Statistics Canada's perspective and maybe a word or two about who I am. So I think Andrew has given you a really good idea about the household level data that we produce in official statistics at Stats Canada. And my role at Stats Canada is I'm really more on the macroeconomic side. So those indicators that you see that come out every quarter on household debt and debt service ratios and things like that, that falls within my domain, and it's very much linked to production statistics that we do, for example, on the gross domestic product, part of an integrated set of accounts. So I guess before I launch into this question, I just want to say that I'm really thankful to have the opportunity to come here today. It's a very valuable opportunity for both Andrew and I to understand really what the questions are that you need to address. As I'm sure that you're very sensitive to, we are a national statistics organization that has finite resources, but in order for us to set priorities and make strategic investments in the statistical system, we really need your input. So and we have opportunities here to also build partnerships with you in terms of both improving the quality and depth of the statistics that we produce, but maybe getting access to new and innovative data sets that could help us in the compilation of official statistics. So, do we have the data, I guess, to understand household financial instability? Well, I think Liz has already answered that question. So in a word, no. We have certain data that give us messages, tell us certain things about the financial health of households, of Canadian households. Do we have all the answers? Absolutely not. So what are some of the answers that we do have? Well, we have the macroeconomic indicators. We have a quarterly release of aggregate household income, consumption, saving, and wealth. These are compiled within a coherent accounting framework, like I said, that's based on international standards that have a great deal of rigor. The focus of these statistics, these big economic indicators, is really to position the household sector in terms of the entire economy. So how does it interrelate with other economic sectors, which we define as the corporate sector, financial and non-financial, the government sector. We have a subset of the nonprofit institution sector that we break out separately, that is the part that serves households, and how do we interact with the rest of the world. Then we, of course, have these micro-based sources, which include a broad range of household surveys and admin tax type products. And Andrew talked about how we have tax-based products, but we also integrate tax data into our survey program as a standard compilation technique in Stats Canada. Now, most of what I call the micro-based sources, or the household level sources, are annual surveys or based on tax information such as the T1, compilation of the T1 tax data. The Survey of Financial Security, which Andrew gave you a good expose of earlier this morning, is actually now a triennial survey. So starting in 2016, we have permanent funding at Statistics Canada to collect those data every 3 years, which is a very recent development. As Andrew had mentioned, it was only collected on an ad hoc basis in the past when we were able to secure funding. So now we have made that investment, along with other investments in the statistical system, and I'll talk to you about some of those. And then, of course, also on the household side, we have very timely labor indicators. So the things that come out of the employment data, LFS, there's also some information on hours and incomes, and the survey of employment, payroll, and hours more from the employer side. So a little bit about the microdata. So this is what you hear in the news, pretty much every quarter. So you'll see this data goes up to the third quarter of 2017. And actually, we're going to be releasing the fourth quarter at the end of next week. So it's pretty timely data. Quarterly comes out with the GDP, or around the GDP release. The wealth release is actually staggered by about 2 weeks after the GDP release. So this is comparing household credit market debt to GDP. And that's not necessarily a relevant metric, but it just to give you an idea in terms of scale. So if you look at this time series, which goes from 1990, you'll see that, this ratio of household credit market debt to GDP was stable up until the early 2000s, when it started to climb fairly steadily. And then there was a big spike during the financial crisis, which is that pink area that is highlighted there. So the 2008-9 recession. Then it stabilized again until 2015, when we had that technical recession, the 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. So that's in terms of the big picture. Now, how do we break that down in the macroeconomic statistics? So here's a few indicators, some of which often do get quoted in the news as well. And I like this chart because it's very telling, but of course it only gives you the overall average, and we understand that the overall average isn't the only thing that we need to understand. But, so if you look at this, the red line on this chart, this is basically the ratio of household credit market debt to GDP, to personal disposable income. And that ratio has been steadily rising over time. The green line is the ratio of debt to assets. And if you look in the recent period, that's actually been declining. What's this all about? It's about the housing market, right? So housing values in aggregate are appreciating faster than the mortgage debt that's taking on. So do we have a problem? If you also look at the debt service ratio, which is the ratio of debt to the obligated payments to consumer debt, that ratio is still stable. So what it really tells you is it's all about the housing market and whether or not those gains in the housing market are sustainable. Now, just a few things that you may or may not be aware of that we have done to elaborate the macroeconomic data. So we have started publishing distributions of household economic accounts. So we've taken these macro estimates, which are very high-level aggregates, and we've combined them with household-level information to develop distributions of income, consumption, saving, and wealth by quintile and selected characteristics. And so far, we've only taken sort of little baby steps. And so we have age, family type, like being, for example, a single-person household or not. And we've done some statistics by province. Now, the thing that's interesting about this stuff is that it's aligned with the macro concepts, so you can see the distributional impacts of macroeconomic developments within the same types of concepts. Now, we do have a longer-term vision for building an underlying foundations database at the household level. It's very difficult to achieve. There are many, many complexities. We don't know when we'll be able to do it, but that is something that we would like to do, that you could actually align with our concepts. This is just to give you an idea of some of the statistics we have put out, and this was only in the last year. So we can now show you these macroeconomic data decomposed. So let's saving, and here what I mean by saving is, this is the flow concept. So how much does income exceed consumption in the current period? So if you look at saving, for example, by income quintile, the statistics that we previously released was only that dotted line, so that overall average, the dotted black line. And now if you look at the quintiles, you can see that the lower quintiles are actually dissaving over long periods of time, and all of the saving is more or less occurring in the upper quintile. So that certainly does get away from this idea that these averages are indicators of generalized behavior. Now, the new frontier, we know that this is still not enough. Existing sources lack sufficient granularity. We've heard all about it today, and it was actually kind of daunting for me to follow Catherine, because here she was talking about neighborhood level data and all of this stuff.
It's modeled,
so, yeah. So obviously we've got, demands for, a really low level of geography, really detailed household characteristics. It's really important for us to understand this and what types of households are impacted by these trends. We can't obviously understand financial instability or the financial health of the household sector by looking at aggregates. And our policy partners, like folks in Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada, they need very timely information in order to make policy decisions on tax policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. So our challenges as a statistical organization are to come up with some innovative solutions to meet these information demands, and we have some constraints that we have to face in order to do that. So the world we're operating in, we can't impose, I think I got an extra 5 minutes, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Okay, because she's telling me my time.
Yeah,
so.
it's okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Sorry, didn't warn you guys. You're doing a great job.
Thanks.
Okay.
But I am going to wrap it up pretty soon here. So, So we really need to find some innovative solutions without imposing increased response burden on reluctant respondents. One of the challenges we're having in household surveys is that it's harder and harder to get people on the phone. They now have cell phones, they screen their calls, they don't want to talk to us, So we have to find other ways of supplementing this information, both from a data quality and an output type point of view. We also need to be able to provide a clear and credible guarantee of confidentiality, which we're very experienced at Statistics Canada. So we have the legal framework and we have the internal policies, which kind of provide that ironclad guarantee. And we have to do this all at the same time as we either maintain or improve data quality and continue with the relevance of our statistics. So the new frontier. So we have a modernization initiative at Statistics Canada. And so we're really trying to go fairly boldly where we have not yet gone as a statistical organization. And some of you may have heard of some of this because we've been doing a lot of outreach on it. So this new approach that we're trying to take as an organization really focuses on the users. So it's a user-centric approach. We want to understand what you need and find innovative ways of providing it. We emphasize partnerships. We're looking at acquiring new administrative data sources that are emerging with the digital economy. And some of these sources that we haven't maybe exploited in official statistics in the past, we're now looking at exploiting in official statistics, as are, by the way, many other statistical organizations all across the world. So these outfront techniques around big data, how do we use big data, developing the capacity to process big data and maintain quality, using record linkage to combine existing data sorts to maximize their potential, and providing this ironclad guarantee of security and confidentiality, because as we move into using these big data sources, that becomes increasingly more important. This, I believe, is my last slide. So I'll give you an example. We have a number of what we call pathfinder programs at Stats Canada. And these are programs that we're looking at as examples in this new modern method or in the modernization project. So one of these Pathfinder projects you may be familiar with is called the Canadian Housing Statistics Program. And we released the first data from this back in December. And basically this housing statistics program combines a very broad range of administrative data and survey sources to create a comprehensive national database at the address level. So it combines things like housing characteristics and property values from things as diverse as municipal assessment rolls, StatsCan's address register, using information from different sources, like from CMHC, for example, and private sector providers. And not just in terms of the housing characteristics and their value, but also in terms of the corresponding financial obligations associated with that particular address. So not just mortgages, but all of the financial obligations associated with that address. So this, now the stats we released back in December really focused on the foreign ownership in housing and foreign ownership rates. Yeah, I know my time is really up now. I'm wrapping it up. But there's all kinds of potential to release all kinds of different types of detailed statistics. And you'll remember those stats actually produced foreign ownership rates and housing characteristics at the neighborhood level for Toronto and Vancouver. So anyway, all kinds of potential for more detailed stats at a low level geography, but we need to move into different areas where StatsCan kind of hasn't ventured before, so it really is a new era. And if you're interested, I'll just conclude by saying that the other Pathfinder projects are the subjects that are dealt with them. There are 4 of them actually now at Stats Canada. The Housing Statistics Framework is one of them. The other is cannabis. I'm sure you haven't heard anything about that one. There's also a tourism program and a clean technology, which is really about the transition to a low carbon economy and how to understand that. So I'll finish there.
Good morning, good afternoon almost. Very much happy to be here, especially to have been let out of the ivory tower. I'm going to be talking a little bit. I'm going to start actually with a story. I hadn't originally planned to do this with slides, but you get a researcher in a room and everybody else has slides and they have graphs, and then you go, oh, me too, me too. Okay. So I'm going to start off with the story of presenting some slides using StatsCan's micro data, and I say this as a user who goes into the data centers. When they say that they want ironclad privacy and security, they're not messing around. Like the security chip in my ear, the security screening forms, the blood sample from my firstborn, it's all been by and large worth it. And I want to start with a slightly self-deprecating story with pictures, but not pictures that big. Can we change the zoom? So in June 2016, I gave a paper to the Canadian Economics Association that married data from 6 years of data from 2 different StatsCan surveys to try to develop a bit of a composite picture of national household financial vulnerability in Canada. And I tried to base it on a review of the international literature using examples of what indicators are being used at things like the European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve. You heard from Ray Bochara this morning. So here's a quick review of some of the indicators that I looked at. It's things like missing important payments. It's things like being liquidity constrained. It's things like being excluded from mainstream financial services that help you accumulate some cash savings or get access to affordable credit. And my punchline, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you a few of the top line results. So here you can see some of those indicators. Reasonably common. So a number of households, for example, are quite liquidity constrained. In other words, less than 10% of all of their household assets are actually in liquid form. Other indicators of household potential vulnerability, a little less common, but nevertheless concerning. So things like missing a loan or bill payments. And then while housing payments, for example, falling behind on housing payments was relatively rare, that ought to be a real kind of warning sign for us. Anyway, the punchline to that paper in 2016 was that I was working with data on household assets and debts that was already 4 years out of date, that the Bank of Canada, our central bank here, had already started to rely on a rolling monthly survey that's conducted by a private sector firm, that when I had called that private sector firm, they said, yeah, sure, you can have our data, it'll cost you 5 figures. So then I went to an academic roundtable as part of the Federal Poverty Reduction Plan, and I gave my advice on indicators that they might want to think about. Oh, no, there we go. And so this is looking at whether or not a household would be able to maintain their income at 25% of the median, applicable median household, which is the low-income measure, or LIM, which is what we use for international comparisons of income poverty, whether or not they would be able to do that for just 1 month. And as you can see, shocking numbers of households are not able to do that. And then, so I went in and I, gave my presentation and looked at, here's the overlap between income poverty and asset poverty, and here's what we know about how it's been changing over time, and using different kinds of thresholds, like so how long could you stretch out those financial assets? And I went in guns a-blazing, ready to say, and we need better data. This was back in the fall, and then an official told me what you've already heard from Andrew and from Catherine today, which is good news. We actually have new and regular data that will be coming every 3 years. So I tell that story, or that anecdote, to remind us both that data gaps can be filled, and secondly, that none of us has perfect information about what data is actually available. Okay, but these are all indicators that I've shown you here of financial vulnerability. What about volatility? And if my presentation had just been, do we have that data? It's a one-word presentation, no, right? I know in the Q&A we're going to talk a bit more about kind of who might help fill that gap, what the roles might be. But I thought maybe I would start off by spitballing some ideas around what are the kinds of questions that we might want to try and answer. So I think we need to know more about what's the nature of the phenomenon, right? How many people are affected, how often, how badly? Who is affected and what's driving it? You've already heard the presentations today from TD. In a new forthcoming paper using survey data from Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, Joanna Peets and I find that 25% of Canadians report some volatility either in the source or in the amount of income from month to month. Unfortunately, that survey didn't necessarily set an amount or a measure of the volatility. The most common form of volatility, though, is actually in the source of income, which I think is kind of interesting. Hot off of the laptop, among working age adults, the share of households or the share of Canadians who report having some volatility, either in source or amount, rises to 30%. For those with household incomes under $30,000, goes up to 37%. But even for households with very high income, over $100,000, 23% are still reporting some volatility. So I think it would be really good to work towards some shared definition of what we mean by volatility. Maybe we need to pay attention not only to the amount of the volatility, but also to the source, and also to the direction of the volatility. John Stapleton has pointed out that, for example, for a number of low-income people, even windfall gains are a nightmare financially, right? So while most of us might think winning the lottery is a great thing, that a positive spike in income for a month might be okay, for a lot of other people it isn't. I'm going to stop there because you want to ask questions, and I've got other things to say about what to do. So,
I'll have to tease them out of you. Okay, so thanks, Jen, for kicking us off, and I like the spitballing. So there's some gaps. In your view, having heard what you've heard today, and I'm putting you a bit on the spot, Catherine, because you don't think about this all day long, and Jen, you think about it a little more, but having heard what you heard today, what should be our first priority in terms of filling those data gaps? Like, what should we be trying to put in place?
You want me to start? I mean,
Yeah, go
you want me
ahead.
to start? Is this on? Everybody can hear me? Okay. So I think when we're conceptualizing this, I think it goes back to kind of some of the points maybe I already raised in my little intro presentation. When we look at how we can exploit existing data resources to build databases that can be used to build in the granularity and the depth that we need to get underneath our statistics. So one of the examples that I provided was the housing statistics framework, where we can leverage the infrastructure that we have at Statistics Canada to build a national database that brings together all this information in a coherent framework that's not a whole lot of different researchers bringing it together in different ways. And then we can produce products that can allow us to get at detailed geography, detailed household type, detailed variables underlying that can get at particular questions around this without an enormous investment. I think a challenge for us in terms of at Statistics Canada is this move into the big data world. And it raises a couple of questions for us as an organization. And this is maybe where it's important for these comments not to be attributed. But yeah. But I mean, it's a delicate question because we go out and we ask respondents on a regular basis to provide us information without charge as part of the public good. We would like to exploit many of these commercial databases, and we already do exploit many of these commercial databases in the compilation of our statistics, but they come with a price. So we need to build those partnerships, and I think maybe we need to reassure the providers of those commercial databases that we're not trying to duplicate what they might be trying to market in terms of their own commercial benefit. We're simply trying to use them to improve the compilation of the outputs in official statistics. So that's where I think, from Statistics Canada's view, we need to start.
Great, thank you. Jen?
Let me say, I think there's a role for multiple different sectors here. So StatsCan has just an unparalleled comparative advantage in terms of being able to collect and disseminate really, really good, robust data. One data source that we haven't talked about yet, actually though, that does exist is StatsCan's survey of household spending, which already does ask households to keep, for example, monthly diaries of what it is that they're spending on. Unfortunately, the data, that, at least that I can see, that is in there, still only has that annual income data. So one thing to think about is can we tweak that survey, right, to make it replicate more the financial diaries work that it took place in the United States, and the pilot project that Jerry Buckland and others on his team, myself included, are piloting it in Winnipeg. What else can be done about it? I think there is definitely room for more private sector organizations like CPA Canada, like TD Canada Trust, to be including questions on income volatility when they are fielding surveys to measure household finances already, right? It doesn't cost that much more to add another couple of questions when you're already out in the field. The issue there, though, is I think that we need to do a much better job of coordinating around how do we actually phrase those questions so that we start to get better and more comparable data, right? That said, I think we also need to be collecting data that can be disaggregated, and I appreciate, the desire to disaggregate by community, for example, or even segments of communities, by income quintile. But remember, people who have income volatility don't walk around with a button that says, "Hi, I have an unstable income," right? Like, we need to be able to have other ways to identify them and figure out what are the other characteristics that they have that may already be putting them in positions of precarity. So things like, are they from an Indigenous community? Are they a newcomer to Canada? Are they a person who has a disability? Are they also coping with low income? Do they have low education? Those are the kinds of pieces of data that I think are really critical to collect.
Okay, so I am hearing a little bit of what I had hoped to hear today, to be perfectly honest. This notion that there needs to be a bit of a conversation across sectors around how we fill the gaps and where the priorities are, and how different sectors can contribute to both building out the data set, but also asking the questions and sharing what they're learning. So we just have 2 minutes left. Can I invite each of you just to give your high-level thoughts, again, Chatham House rules, on whose job it is to convene that conversation, and how do we get it going?
You want to start, Jennifer? Okay. I might say something perhaps that StatsCan has a more difficult time saying, okay, which is that StatsCan has to work in response to the demand of its federal partners and to the research community, okay? They are terrific producers of data, but if there isn't a clear demand for it, they can't make it, right? And if there isn't funding to support their work, and there's a huge amount of front-end work, by the way, that has to go in. I lived through the development of one StatsCan survey. It takes like 18 months, right, from kind of beginning to end. So one of the things that we can all do in this room is talk to other federal bodies, like the biggest consumer of StatsCan data, Employment and Social Development Canada. Talk to finance, right? We need to find money to loosen the federal purse strings to ensure that the agency actually is properly resourced if we want them to do the data collection.
I'm glad I let you go first.
Easy act to follow.
So how do we start the conversation? Those are really good points. I mean, we have finite, like I said right at the beginning, we have finite resources and we have to respond to priorities, and often funding comes from federal partners who are the big policy partners. But we need to hear from all of you, and we are trying to rebrand StatsCan into more user-centric. We're trying to get out there, we're trying to listen to more partners than just our regular federal partners. And to come back about how to start this conversation, well, like I said at the beginning, it's a really important opportunity for us to be here. So that we can have this conversation, for example, with the banking sector and the financial sector. We already have a lot of interaction. We already use a lot of information from the supply side. We use information from financial regulators to compile macroeconomic statistics. There is enormous potential in these types of micro-level big data sources, like, for example, credit bureau data, payments data, things like that. We haven't gone there yet. We want to go there. We have started some of the conversations with Payments Canada, for example, with other international organizations, and we started to take steps to get access to credit bureau data, which would really enrich our statistics program, both for the household level data sources and also for the macro data, to build that granularity into the macro data so that when you see those big averages, we can then drill down and provide more detailed information by geography, by household type, and those types of things.
Great. Well, we're definitely feeling your new user-centric direction today. So thank you very much. We're feeling the love. So I want to thank both of our panelists here today for helping us advance our thinking on this fundamental question. So please join me in thanking them. I'll let you guys step down and then we'll open up. We're going to move now just to an open Q&A.
So it's actually a question I want to ask for Catherine. The data set you have is fantastic to looking at neighborhood financial health, and we've been getting a lot of interest in that data actually from the public health sector physical health, not financial health, who really cares a lot about local data, at least in the US. A lot of decisions around healthcare and health policy are made at the county and state level and municipal level. So I'm curious if you've at all in your data set looked at connecting your neighborhood level financial health indicators with physical health indicators and seeing what those correlations might look like. Sorry, I thought the Catherine Scott from the Neighborhood Financial Health Index. Did I get it right?
Sorry about that.
Yes.
We haven't got there yet. I mean, certainly other research that we've done, absolutely, there's tremendous interest in the public health sector, and there are many. Is it people? Oh, okay, sorry. Certainly in other research we've done, we've absolutely explored the connections between the public health sector and the indicators and the population measures they're particularly interested in, and the need for much more detailed, like a broader understanding of security and financial health. And they've been, speaking of, they've been real advocates to reaching out to the folks that are traditionally in the housing sector and the like in demanding this kind of data, because obviously they have a very practical use and experience for the data, and they've been tremendous partners, certainly at City of Toronto and the like. But we haven't explored it yet, but that would be a great place to go to start connecting those making those connections at the neighborhood level, because they live it. And they actually have a mandate. That's the other thing. It's an public agency that has a mandate to seek this out. And we've found that's really important. In the community sector, huge diversity of skill and resources to be able to bring this type of evidence to bear in their practice. The public health sector, although they're invariably saying they're under-resourced compared to the tertiary, like the institutional health sector, which is totally true, but they have the resources and the mandate to be engaged in much of this work, so they are invariably really great community partners on this, but that's a great observation, and we should be doing that. Yes.
There's a, if you're on the US side, there's a great website called countyhealthrankings.org,
Yes.
funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, that does this at every county level. And so we're looking on the US side, how can we connect the data points there?
Well, and it's interesting speaking to that, because the American stuff's always fantastic. The community
Glad
level.
someone thinks so.
No, the community level models that we've explored are tremendous, and the power of rankings. I mean, it's no mistake that when we were looking to use these data visualization tools, we were looking at that, and we worked with municipal decision makers. Now, they're interested certainly in their rankings, but they're not just not like the granularity, but they, what we're trying to do in our national report is they're interested in how they're performing compared to their peers. So in Canada, there's different, just similarly counties. It makes a huge difference to bring that kind of insight, like what's going on in big cities. And the housing story, how that plays out is very regional. It's quite distinct in Canada. So we've been really struck by how useful, when we go to communicate the research, the ranking, those types of tools can be very powerful, particularly if you're attaching an advocacy agenda, which we want things to get better. So that's also a part of our mandate. So.
Does anybody else have a question? Not pause. Catherine.
I've been wanting to ask this question ever since Fiona's presentation earlier this morning, and it kind of builds on some of the points that I've raised. So obviously these payments databases, and you have a very comprehensive one for your own client, for the client base at JP Morgan Chase, have enormous potential. And they have enormous potential in and of themselves as research databases, but they also have enormous potential if they were able to feed into the official statistics in order to both improve their quality and increase granularity, building on the points that I'd made. So I have kind of two questions for you. One of them being, has there been any conversation in the US about the exploitation of these big data sets in official statistics? I know there's a number of bodies in the US that are involved in the compilation of official statistics. And if there has, or even if there hasn't, what kind of conditions would need to be in place in order for that to occur from JP Morgan Chase Institute's point of view?
So yes, there have been some conversations, and I've attended sort of roundtables where the U.S. government is increasingly trying to get access to private data sources, and frankly, they already use a lot of private sector data sources in their national statistics. I think with respect to the JP Morgan Chase data, it's you're asking what kinds of conditions. I don't know, because the data right now, so everything is anonymized at the source before it comes to us. I think the real concerns are around re-identification. And so even if you have 10 data sets that are all de-identified, if you pair them together, you can start re-identifying them. And so that risk is just very, very hard to mitigate or has to be continually monitored. So I think it would have to be, demonstrated expertise in that problem specifically. Under Chatham House rules, I would say probably there is some degree of monitoring, right? We give a lot of data to the federal government every period anyway for monitoring purposes. And I think there's a degree of independence with which we analyze the data for research purposes. And so it would have to be clear that this was for one purpose and not others, right? You can't be it would have to be used for research purposes or monitoring of the economy, not necessarily of the bank. Right, those channels have to be kept separate. But it's a good question, and I think there are players like the Sloan Foundation. I would recommend you reaching out to some of the key players there who are actually trying to work on this question specifically, in which, and institutionally what they're creating is basically kind of a data hub, right, where they're a center of excellence on these privacy issues, on these re-identification questions, and screening who gets access under what conditions, all that sort of thing. So I think it's almost an institutional response that has to be established first before the data providers would be willing to put their piece into the pot.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Catherine.
I've always, thanks to everyone for the presentations, and certainly the survey presentations from the banks, from TD and the different Capital One. There we are. And I take Jennifer's point. We've seen every once in a while, we see different financial partners put out surveys that they do using a range of metrics and questions. And yes, it would be great if we could arrive at a list of variables. But I wonder, in recognizing these are opinion polls effectively, like how much, not value is the wrong word to attach to it, but like, do you feel that people are telling you the truth? Like, this is a big issue in a variety of surveys, famous one, do you smoke or drink when you're pregnant? There's in which they now have very sophisticated ways of taking those sorts of biases into account, or the human behavior being what it is. Do you feel people are actually giving you very accurate estimates of their financial, how does that line up with other objective indicators, or do you go to any type of effort to try to line up, or I'm probably not, but to tackle that question, I worry that people are underreporting, right, because they wouldn't, depending on who they are, wouldn't necessarily feel confident doing that, depending, like if you're a newcomer, you may not choose to, there's a whole set of issues about how people communicate about their financial status, which is tied up with their huge number of different areas, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Great. So Patrick, do you want to answer that? And
yeah, thanks for the question. I think definitely in a bunch of the questions we ask, you have biases in either direction. For me, the strongest ones are going to be around where you're asking someone if they do or do not take some specific action, say budgeting. That one's clear. I've always been amazed. We're able to corroborate some things in our data. For example, we try and do some income validation. We don't necessarily always do that, but that happens sometimes. I'm amazed at how consistent reported income is to the actual income that we see, with the exception of some fraudulent outliers. And then in terms of how often people are missing bill payments, that's the sort of data that we can see. And again, it was actually pretty consistent. So I certainly take the qualitative data with a grain of salt. I do feel like if we could consistently capture certain metrics, and monitor trends and correlations over time, the precision is less relevant. So it would still be value add for us as a group.
Great. I'm just going to comment on behalf of Derek because he's not here, and what I know is that TD actually did look at their payments data and replicated the JP Morgan study, grosso modo, and actually corroborated that what people had self-reported was actually bang on. The accuracy was astounding. So it's quite interesting that people actually do have a very good grasp of what's going on and reporting it accurately. Jen, I know you want to respond to this? Great.
Sure, maybe I can just add in a few additional thoughts here. So with that CPA Canada data that I'm working with presently, I thought it would be of interest to know 60% of the 3,500 respondents said that they didn't know or would prefer not to talk about whether or not their household income is volatile in any way, shape, or form. So I think that finding is kind of interesting in terms of what we're actually seeing. I would say that all surveys have the potential, whether they are done by StatsCan or whether they're done by a financial institution or by a public opinion polling firm purchased by, their services purchased by a financial institution, they all have the possibility of underrepresenting vulnerable groups, right? Because it's much easier to sample people who have stable homes, who have a consistent phone line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I think what we really need here are a mix of methods. So things like the financial diaries approach, which we're trying to replicate now in Winnipeg, that needs to be replicated in other communities as well so that we get that very, very rich, but not necessarily generalizable data. We need better StatsCan data that can be generalized. It is, nationally representative survey data. I'm certainly not going to be, as a researcher, I'm a data taker, so I'm not going to turn up my nose if private sector organizations want to collect and provide and share and disseminate more data, absolutely. But I would make a pitch for when we are sharing this data with each other, number one, let's try and get some better agreement around how we're measuring this phenomenon. And number two, let's also make sure that we're being transparent about our collection methods as well as other indicators of the data quality.
Great. Oh my. Sure.
I think just wanted to hook onto that. Those are great points from Jennifer as well, and I didn't mean to necessarily try and understate it, because if you just actually think about the basic problem we're facing, that people aren't necessarily keeping track of their finances, to then ask them backward looking, how much did it move? I mean, certainly that felt a little bit silly to me as I was going through that process and realizing that both of these things were true at the same time. So I certainly also, definitely like the idea of how do we get people to track things themselves that maybe aren't tracked today, so that we can get insight into that in addition to what qualitative data we can turn out.
Great. Do we have another question over? Andrew.
Thank you. So, Fiona, I wanted to just pursue the comments you made about the concern that a financial institution, and I'll generalize beyond JP Morgan Chase, might have about making some of these data sets available to the official sector. And I think the distinction I heard you draw was the use of this information potentially for economic or social policy purposes versus monitoring of the bank's activity. And what I found interesting about that, and I'd like to push it a little further, is that as a regulated financial institution, subject to, among other things, sales conduct requirements, the bank itself, or any bank or a broker-dealer or an insurance company, whomever, has the opportunity to begin to use that same data set to ensure that it is itself complying with the requisite standards. And at that point, that becomes a very powerful defense or ammunition for the institution to show the regulatory sector that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. It becomes then quite easy, I think, to use some of the data outputs as extensions for supporting social policy goals. But I was curious about, at JP Morgan Chase, the degree to which the other consumers of this information are, in fact, your compliance colleagues, your legal colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think to the extent that we can push, we the system can push institutions to make better use of this data for those purposes, it'll become much more available for others.
Yeah, so certainly folks within the bank are consumers of our research, just the way that any of you in this room are consumers of our research. The distinction I'm trying to make is really predicated on the burden of proof. So, for example, obviously, when we make a credit decision, we have to prove that we're not discriminating, against people on the basis of any kind of protected class. And so, when you make credit decisions, you have to get it right on the individual basis. You have to get it right each and every time with each and every touch point. We at the Institute do not hold ourselves to that level of precision. What we're trying to get right is the estimates in aggregate. So this comes up, for example, in model governance. Now I'm getting really wonky, but right, so the bank can have models that estimate somebody's income. We see some flows, but we don't know all the flows. We estimate their income, we estimate their assets, all kinds of stuff. The model governance that that type of model has to go through, if it's informing credit decisions, is a completely different, governance process than if we at the Institute are roughly trying to get an income estimation right for the purposes of segmenting our samples by quintile. And so we don't plan to or, have no intentions of going through those model governance structures that are applied for individual credit decisions, because we're not moving money on the basis of the analytics that we're doing. So that's the sense in which the bar is different, the goal of the analytics are different, and so, I wouldn't want those, and we're very clear within the bank about that distinction, because at the Institute, we're not moving money based on the analytics.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I guess the point I was trying to draw was, as you just highlighted, the bar is very high, be it for validation of credit models or capital models. When I was a banking regulator, we validated the capital models that the major Canadian banks use to set their capital requirements for various business activities. And that is a remarkably high bar. The point is then the work has been done in the sense that you validated the data set, you validated the models. It should be a lower bar than to convince the institution to allow the use of, at least subject to the re-identification issues you highlighted, and those are very real. But there should be a way we can link that. I think the Institute has done incredible work, and the organization, the bank, needs to be complimented for this, because I think they can be very much a leader going forward. But I want to figure out how we can leverage it from there.
Yeah, certainly we look to our risk partners, in the underwriting departments. We are consumers of some of the data analytics they're producing. And so we're downstream from some of the stuff they're producing. But it's a little bit of a one-way street because of the issues that I described, right? So certainly, yeah, we're learning a lot from them, and they're learning a lot from us conceptually, but less frequently are they, sometimes they are using our analytics or our logic that kind of undergirds things, but then they take it in their own direction.
I didn't want to lose the point that for 1 in 20 Canadians who derive most of their income from social assistance, from many more Canadians that get most of their, or who are receiving employment insurance, and others who are getting programs like income from Canada Pension Plan Disability, we require volatility. We celebrate volatility. When you have monthly backwards reconciliation of income each month, yet most pay periods are either...
Speak into the mic, John. I'm sorry.
That pay periods are actually either bi-weekly or it can be, you can get 3 pay months and 5 pay months. When you reconcile income on a monthly basis, you're actually enforcing volatility. So it's not something that we've tried to stay away from in public policy. It's actually something that we enforce and celebrate. Someone who's on CPP disability and works over $8,000 a year, I forget the actual current threshold, will be taken off that income support in its entirety. And if someone is receiving EI and they get that question that says, were you ready, willing, and able to work each week, and you're doing a couple of weeks of caregiving, then you should answer that question as saying, no, I wasn't available for work and therefore get cut off EI for those couple of weeks. So I think there's a sense in which our income security programs in that sense, enforce and require and even celebrate volatility, and that we haven't had a public policy shift to say that volatility is important and maybe we ought to reduce the levels of volatility.
I think that's a good point, and I think we're going to get this afternoon into with David's presentation on the solutions framework, the modernization of our income security programs to take into account these realities we're describing today is very much